Welcome. I've got a sure enough, or sure enough, as they say in Georgia, treat for you guys today. I was able to snag an interview with Dr. Philipp Nothaft out of Belfast, Ireland, who teaches out there. He's also an associate at Oxford College, and he approaches the subject of Christmas and the December 25th date and etc. from a strictly historical or historian approach. So, you can get your popcorn or put your thinking cap on because you're going to need it. This guy is highly intelligent. You can listen to what he has to say, and I thought, what better way to be educated than to talk with somebody who knows the subject better than myself and better than most of the general public. So, without further ado, here's Dr. Philipp Nothaft.
All right, good day to all you brothers and sisters out there. We have a special guest, Mr. Philipp Nothaft. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from Belfast in Northern Ireland. We're going to discuss some aspects of the holiday, Christmas, with Dr. Nothaft, and specifically the December 25th date. I've been researching this for many years now and decided to go back and refresh my memory on some things, and I kept coming across his name. I read three of your articles, one from 2011, and then from 2012, and then from 2013. I've read those three articles probably in the past couple of weeks and really appreciated the work that you did there. Before we get started, Philip, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, in the simplest terms, I'm an historian who deals mostly with the history of knowledge in the pre-modern world. So it's pretty broadly conceived. I'm interested in the history of science, but also in the history of philosophy and theology and scholarship more broadly. And I really look at something like the history of Christmas from this angle. I'm interested in what Christian scholars way back when believed, or what kind of arguments they made, and the basis on which they made these arguments. That's what I'm trying to get a better understanding of, essentially.
Now, I noticed when I looked you up, you work there at Oxford College or somewhere in that area? Or?
Yes, I have an appointment in Trinity College Dublin, but I'm also a fellow of All Souls College in Oxford.
Okay. The first thing I want to ask you is about when Christians began to theorize a date for the birth of Christ. What has your studies led you to find in that area?
Well, it's difficult to be exact about these sorts of things, but it's fairly clear that by the end of the second century of the Christian era, Christians have begun to investigate these questions, to speculate, to propose different traditions or different potential dates for the crucifixion of Christ, but also his conception and his birth. And the first source to really shed light on this properly is Clement of Alexandria in his Miscellanies or Stromates, where he first of all proposes a date for the birth of Christ, which is already in winter, according to him, at least implicitly. He proposes, or he reports, various opinions on when Christ died, but also reports various opinions as to the date of his conception, which all are spring dates. So they're close to the
Mm,
date of his death. They're Passover dates, probably. It's hard to say because they're all expressed in the Egyptian calendar. The thing is, there are certain ambiguities when you read these Greek Christian authors, the ones who write in Greek, because the term genesis, which just
mm,
means beginning or origin, technically could refer either to the birth of a person or to the conception.
mm.
But Thomas Schmidt, who's a scholar who did his
Yeah.
PhD in Yale a couple of years ago, he published this article where he argues, I think, quite persuasively that usually the conception is being
Mm,
referenced in these Greek texts when they talk about Jesus. So, based on that assumption, I think that Clement already documents the existence of a tradition of assuming that Jesus was conceived in spring. And of
mm.
course, corollary to that is that he was born in winter. That was already a thing at the end of the second century. And of course, by the beginning of the fifth century, that has become pretty much canonical. That's almost universally shared, the assumption of a spring conception and a winter birth. It wasn't the only game in town throughout this period. From the middle of the third century, we have a Latin text which assumes that what coincides would be the birth and the crucifixion of Christ. So we have this Latin author in 243 who uses calendrical cycles to essentially reconstruct when Passover would have happened in the year of the Passion and also in the year of Christ's birth, because he assumes that both the birth and the death happened at Passover. And he arrives at the conclusion that Jesus was born on March 28th, which is an important date for this author because he also comes to the conclusion that the sun was created on the on March 28th, which is of course the fourth day of creation. So to him, the conclusion is that the sun and Jesus share a birthday, and he uses some Old Testament vocabulary referring to Christ as the Son of Righteousness. So there's a certain solar symbolism which ties in with this idea that the same date applies to the birth of Christ and the creation of the sun. But overall, by the 5th century, as I mentioned, we have a spring conception as a winter birth as a very widely shared assumption. And then we have 2 dates by that point in time, which are widely circulating, December 25th and January 6th, of course. Nowadays, the only church or the only branch of Christianity which still holds to January 6th as the birth date of Jesus is the Armenian Church. But in late antiquity, that was still a bit more widespread, especially in the East.
Now, the document that you mentioned from, I think it was 243 AD, is that, and I'm not good on Latin, so you can correct my pronunciation, but is that something called the De Pascal Computas? Is that what you're referring to there?
Exactly. That's De Pascal Computus, and that is a North African text, which is ascribed to Saint Cyprian. That's probably not very reliable, but it's probably a North African text, yeah.
Is it ambiguous as to whether the conception or the birth of Christ is being talked about in that particular document?
In that one, it isn't, because it's the Latin word nativitas, which can only mean nativity or birth. However, what I suspect is possible that this is somebody who is maybe influenced by an earlier Greek text where the word genesis might have been used for the conception, but it's then interpreted by this Latin author as meaning birth. That's a hypothesis that we can maybe consider. But if you look at the meaning of the word, he refers to the birth.
And I understood you right, correct me if I'm wrong, that you understood Clement of Alexandria to be speaking of the conception when he gives the dates based on the Egyptian months there in his Stromata?
Yeah, when he refers to spring dates, I think he refers to conception dates that have been proposed by earlier Christians. He himself also proposes a birth date. He specifies the precise number of days, months, and years between the birth of Christ and the death of the Emperor Commodus, who was the last emperor who died before he wrote this text. And based on that interval, we can infer that he already considered that the birth of Christ happened in winter.
So as far as you know, there is no record of anybody discussing dates for the birth of Christ prior to around 200 AD. Is that correct?
Nothing that we could be confident about, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to something in Luke chapter 1. And after I read those 3 articles that you wrote, Dr. Nothaft, I remember that I saw you on a documentary called The Christmas Question. I think it was a couple years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
I saw your picture on one of the articles, and I was like, I think I remember that guy. And so then I went back and looked at the documentary, and I remember that you had commented some on Luke 1 and the course of Abijah, when Zechariah, the father of who would become John the Baptizer, served in the temple there in Luke chapter 1. Is there anything that we can ascertain based upon the information we're given in Luke 1 about the course of Abijah? Is there anything we can ascertain about the timing of the birth of either John the Baptizer or Jesus of Nazareth?
It's pretty tricky. The thing is, we know too little about the precise way in which these priestly courses succeeded each other. It's clear that there's a cycle, right? They officiate in turn, and there are 24 of them. And according to Josephus, who's of course still pretty close to the period that we're interested in, they succeeded each other on a weekly basis. Each course officiates from Sabbath to Sabbath. The question is, was this really consistently applied, or did they maybe reset at the beginning of each calendrical year? And how many interruptions to this cycle might there have been between, let's say, the birth of Jesus or the conception of John the Baptist on the one hand and the destruction of the temple on the other? Because modern scholars who try to reconstruct these events described in Luke 1, they usually start with the year 70 AD, which is the destruction of the Second Temple, because there's a Talmudic or pre-Talmudic tradition according to which the first of the priestly courses was on duty on the 9th of the month of Av, when, according to tradition, the destruction occurred. So if you take this at face value, you have a starting point for a calculation, but there are still so many variables that you can second guess that it's really hard to come to a definitive conclusion. I mean, one thing one can say is that some modern scholars have tried their best to come to a conclusion, and some of these conclusions actually support the winter birth as well, assuming that there's a 14 or 15-month time window between the conception of John the Baptist and the birth of Christ.
The document you mentioned that talks about the 9th of Av, how do we date that document? What year was that from?
It's a Jewish tradition. I think the earliest mention is in the Seder Olam Rabbah, which is a 2nd century chronicle. It's a bit difficult to see when exactly that text originated, but it's sort of the basis for rabbinic Jewish chronography, really. So it's slightly pre-Talmudic, is from the Mishnaic period, very, very roughly speaking. And I think you already find that tradition in there, and then it's repeated in later rabbinic sources.
Right. Okay. And there were, what is it, First Chronicles 24, I think, talks about how that there were 24 courses of priests. And I think there's a text in First Chronicles 23 that mentions the same thing as Josephus, where they would serve from Sabbath to Sabbath. I think Josephus says 8 days from Sabbath to Sabbath. But I've read so many articles on this recently, and some people say that they would pause during the 3 major festivals because all the priests would serve while they were in Jerusalem. And then the courses would pick back up after, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. But then, you have intercalation at the end of the year. You have Adar 2 on the Jewish calendar. And you wonder if the courses just continue to go. Do they restart at the first of the year? And I haven't been able to pin anything down. Yeah, pretty much exactly what you just said.
Yes, these are some of the problems we face. Intercalation is another one that I could have mentioned. And it's just a question of, is it just the weekday cycle? Does the calendar also play a role in regulating which course is on duty at which given point in time? There's at this stage, it's a bit up for grabs, right? Different scholars have different opinions. What I propose, right, as part of my research, is that some early Christians ignored the fact that Zechariah was a member of the Abiyah priestly course, but instead assumed incorrectly that he was a high priest, because we have quite a few sources which either just allude to that or outright state that he was the high priest. And of course, if that's your assumption, then it's very tempting to assume that this whole scene in Luke 1 takes place on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. That gives you a Jewish calendrical date, the 10th of Tishri, and you can, of course, tell when, roughly speaking, relative to the Julian calendar, that would have occurred, namely in late September, early October. And that, too, would get you to the assumption that Christ was born in winter. And I think that might be the reason why quite early on already in the late 2nd century, you have this opinion that the birth took place in winter. And then at some stage, they fine-tune that theory by settling on a date, which eventually is, of course, December 25th, and we can talk about the reasons for that as well. But I think it's not unlikely that maybe this slight misreading of Luke 1 could have given rise to this tradition. I mean, there are other possibilities as well, right? And I'm not putting this forward as the definitive truth, but just looking at the sources, that's one possibility.
Sure, yeah, I appreciate that. What about Luke chapter 2, verse 8? It was very popular for me to hear from people that I kind of grew up around. I grew up around a lot of people that didn't believe that Jesus was born on December 25th. And one of the things that they would point out in Luke chapter 2, verse 8, is that there were shepherds in Bethlehem keeping watch over their flocks by night. It's become a very popular argument. As a matter of fact, a lot of the older commentators like Adam Clarke and John Gill, they would talk about this and say, like Adam Clarke says, the winter nativity should be disregarded on these grounds. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that as well, that if you go back to earlier scholarship, that passage was used as a basis for argumentation. I think it's fallen out of favor to do anything with that potential seasonal indication, because if you look at the microclimate in Judea, it's really hard to say whether there is an appropriate time for shepherds to herd their flocks outside. That could really happen all year round. I think that's what many people nowadays assume. I mean, I used to live in Jerusalem. I can't really tell whether it seems to me that a winter birth is just as plausible as any other season, just based on that one passage.
Yeah, I kind of found the same thing too. I ran across a study. I think the guy's last name was Harriman. I don't know if you've read K.R. Harriman, but he had a section in a pretty long treatise. He had a section about Luke 2 verse 8, and he was talking about too, how do we know what's cold for us may not have been cold to Bedouin shepherds in the first century, so
Yeah.
um,
I
so
mean, it can get very cold for a brief period around,
sure.
midwinter in Judea, but not every year.
Yeah, not every year. Yeah, people like to show these pictures with it snowing, in Bethlehem, but then I
Yeah.
I went and saw some pictures where it's like 50 degrees.
Mm.
When did Christians begin to celebrate a feast or a holy day for the birth of Christ? So we talked about the date, when they started to theorize about the date of his conception and birth, based upon his death, and maybe we can get back to something on that I just remembered. But when did they begin to celebrate a holy day or a festival for the
Yeah.
birth of Christ?
So first of all, I appreciate the way you asked that question, because you draw an important distinction, right? It's one thing to assign a date to the nativity of Christ. The other is to start making that an important event in the liturgical year. And in fact, there must have been at least some gap between those two events, because there's some indications that December 25th was already in the runnings as a potential
Mm-hmm.
birth date very early on in the early 3rd century. It's not entirely clear, but I think it's very likely. But the earliest indications that we have a feast, or at least a liturgical commemoration, are from the 4th century. And it's a bit hard to pinpoint that. I mean, there is a so-called chronograph of 354. It was originally a voluminous collection of calendrical and chronological texts, of which we only have much, much later copies. But one of the items in this collection is a list of martyrs, and that includes a note regarding the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem on December 25th. And a lot of scholars believe that the original version of that list dates from 336, and that has traditionally been considered to be the earliest attestation of Christmas. It's a bit difficult to really set. I mean, we have to be clear. This note doesn't really mention a feast; it just mentions that Christ was born on that date.
Interesting.
Then you go a bit. Towards the end of the 4th century. I mean, one important source is a sermon that was delivered by John Chrysostom in Constantinople in 386. And the way Chrysostom talks about the Christmas, which at that point was definitely an important liturgical event and the occasion of sermons in church. And he says that this feast on December 25th has just been introduced to Constantinople, but it's in fact an old tradition in Rome. We don't know what he really means by old, right? How far back that might go, but that makes it plausible to me that it's been around at least since the middle of the 4th century, potentially much earlier.
Sure.
We also have a sermon, also on the occasion of December 25th, another nativity sermon from quite probably from a North African bishop named Optatus of Milevis. And that one has been dated by modern scholars to the reign of Julian the Apostate, who reigned from 361 to 363. To be perfectly clear, this Latin sermon is not transmitted under the name of Optatus, and it doesn't carry a date. That is the assumption that it was held by him at that point in time is the result of scholarly conjecture. Very good, very plausible scholarly conjecture, but we have to be careful. But if we accept the attribution and the dating of that sermon, then we can be pretty sure that Christmas existed, or at least, again, Christmas in the sense of a liturgical feast on December 25th existed by the 360s.
Sure. Have you ever heard of the theory or hypothesis that the document that you mentioned from 354, I heard a scholar, her name was Susan K. Roll, recently, and she mentioned that she now thinks that it's possible that was a later interpolation into that particular document because it was listed in a group of bishops in one text or a group of martyrs in another text. Didn't really fit. Have you looked at that any?
Yeah, exactly. This is a point where scholars disagree, and to me, I don't even know what to think, because I think it's just as likely that this is authentic as it might have been interpolated. We have to stress the fact that we don't have any early copies of this chronograph. The earliest complete copy is even early modern, and then we have sort of partial copies that are medieval. But there were so many centuries during which this original corpus of text could have been manipulated in some way. that I find it perfectly possible that it's an interpolation, but at the same time, the arguments that have been made in this direction are not entirely convincing either. It's I think a bit of an unknown, and that's why I put the emphasis on the sermons by Optatus and of John Chrysostom. These are much better, much more solid evidence of the earliest attestation of Christmas than the chronograph, for the reasons you just mentioned.
Okay, so we do have evidence that Christmas was celebrated liturgically as a feast or holy day mid to late 4th century.
Yeah.
So nobody was celebrating Christmas as a feast or holy day, let's say 1st or 2nd century, and I guess 3rd century either. What prompted Christians to create a festival or holy day for the birth of Christ?
That's a good question. So here we are completely in the realm of speculation. I mean, I would agree with you. It's unlikely that this already was a tradition early on, because we have some indications that Christians of the first 3 centuries were skeptical towards, for instance, the practice of celebrating birthdays, which was a pagan practice, or seen as such. There's some indication, for instance, in Origen, that this perspective existed, and that might have, kept them from putting much emphasis on the birth of Christ. And what has been suggested many times by historians is that it was the Christological debates of the early 4th century which might have paved the way towards Christmas, being the Nativity receiving more emphasis in order to combat, Docetism and Arianism and other forms of heresies, which denied completely that Jesus was also a man and not just God, or which in other ways de-emphasized the incarnation. In order to underscore an orthodox Christology, maybe Christmas became, more prominent. That's one theory that's been, presented in various ways over the decades. But it's clear, we should be clear, there is no direct source evidence to this effect. I find it plausible, but it's hard to say whether it really happened that way.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. So explain to us in a nutshell, if you can. I know this is going to be complicated, but they're popularly called the history of religions theory versus the calculation theory. So the history of religions theory is the popular theory. I mean, you can hit Google, right, and you can pull up all kinds of articles and websites that talks about how that the Christians co-opted the pagan feast of Saturnalia or Sol Invictus. Explain to us the differences and the strengths and weaknesses of those two competing theories.
So the history of religion theory, it's difficult to say whether it's really old or new. In its present form, it essentially developed around the year 1900 in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it was pushed by historians who were very, invested in the idea of seeing Christianity as one of many religions and religious movements and cults that existed in late antiquity, and which all interacted with each other and influenced each other in various ways. That was an attractive idea. And, some historians, in a sense, that's my opinion, went overboard a little bit with just, heaping assumptions upon assumptions, by arguing there was an important pagan celebration, festival, feast, whatever you want to call it, on December 25th, which was so popular that in order to, keep the popularity of this feast from overshadowing or from maybe being too attractive to Christians. I mean, there are various ideas, right? One idea is that Christians celebrated this pagan feast as well, and so in order to keep them from sort of, going astray, the church proposed its own version of that feast on December 25th. That's one idea that's been put out there. And the various just variants of, it's always about the idea there's a pagan feast which is somehow copied or enculturated, or some people use the word hijack, right? Whatever you want to say, the point is there's not really any evidence of that. It sounds like an interesting idea, but there are lots of misunderstandings, I think, about Roman non-Christian religion at that time. And there's often this assumption that the solstice was a highly important event in so-called pagan religions, right, which is sometimes just lumped together in these arguments. And it's important to emphasize we don't really have much evidence that the solstice was the occasion of an important feast in late antique Rome. The earliest indications that anything was going on December 25th in non-Christian Roman cults comes from at the middle and the late 4th century. So it dates to the same period as the earliest evidence for Christmas. And the question also arises: why would the late antique church have tried to create an alternative to a pagan feast, given the fact that most of the time when we read early Christian literature, there's a lot of concern
Yeah.
that there might be too much influence of pagan practices on the way
Yeah.
Christians worship, right? And there was a concern to forestall these types of influences, and so it would be out of character, for these early bishops and church fathers to then introduce a feast simply because the same date was popular amongst pagans. So there are many doubtful elements to this history of religions theory, and it's interesting to see that over the past 10 years, really, it has lost a lot of credibility, and scholars seem to be moving away from it more than
Wow.
compared to maybe 20 or 30 years ago. At least that's my impression just from reading the literature. And never mind the fact that it's still very popular, amongst the general population, I guess. If you look at the way these things are argued about on social media, you can tell that the history of religious theory still has a lot of cachet, but we just lack the evidence to really make a credible case in favor of it. At least that's my opinion.
I was reading Tertullian some the other day, and I noticed that he came down really strong against the Roman festival of Saturnalia. As a matter of fact, he was rebuking some of his fellow Christians for kind of sneaking over and beginning to do some of the customs of Saturnalia, and he was just really against it. And of course, there are other pre-Nicene church fathers that speak against idolatry pretty heavily as well. So it seems kind of counterintuitive for them to try to want to adopt a pagan date or a pagan feast, co-opted at that particular time in Christianity. Maybe later on in the medieval period it might make more sense, but early on it doesn't. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me when I was reading that. It didn't seem like Tertullian would be the kind of guy that said, okay, well, we'll just take these customs from the Saturnalia and we'll incorporate them into the festival of the Nativity of our Lord. It just didn't seem like something he would do. That's kind of, I think, what you're saying. It doesn't make sense that early Christianity would do that.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And even after Christmas had become an established liturgical event, if you read the Christmas sermons of theologians and church fathers of the 5th and later centuries, they never really mention the existence of a pagan feast that might be going on around the same time. There are very few references, and if there are references, they tend to be just tend to be reference to the solstice, right? So, because sometimes people get confused. They see a reference to the solstice and think that's a reference to a pagan feast. That's not necessarily the same thing. Solstice is just a fact of nature, right? And it's traditionally associated with December 25th, and that might be part of the reason why this date was chosen by Christians. But to make there's a difference between being attracted by a solar symbolism that's attached to a date and copying a pagan feast. These are two different propositions, and in the past they've sometimes been conflated a little bit,
Yeah. So you mentioned this early on, but since we're on this history of religions versus calculation theory, let's talk about it a little bit more. It's become more popular, you said, in the last 10 years or so, for scholars to hold to the calculation theory, and I'm guessing that this has to do with the early Christian writings that date the conception of Jesus in spring, and therefore about 9 months later, approximately, we come to a winter date. Tell us a little bit more about the calculations theory.
I mean, I don't know if it's becoming more popular, but I'm sure that the history of religions theory has become less popular amongst
Okay.
I think that's probably the right way of framing it. But yeah, I think there are two elements to how the calculation theory gets off the ground. The first is that by the early 5th century, we have a tradition not just of dating the birth of Christ to December 25th, but also his conception to March 25th, and the conception of John the Baptist to September 24th, and his birth on 24th. These 4 dates, which of course, they hang together quite logically because they're 9 months between conception and birth, and based on Luke 1, 6 months between the conception of John and Jesus. So there's obviously a scriptural basis for these intervals, but the specific dates are the traditional Roman dates of the equinoxes and solstices. Traditional in the sense that they go back maybe as far as the introduction of the Julian calendar in 45 BC, not earlier than that, because before that the Roman calendar wasn't a solar calendar. But so we have that tradition where in principle each of these 4 dates could have or 3 of these dates could have been derived from just one of them, right? If you have one of these dates and you count forward your 6 and 9 months, you get the other 3 essentially. So that's one element to the calculation theory. The other is that if you look back to the earliest sources we have, you see that March 25th is already at the beginning of the 3rd century considered to be either the date of the crucifixion or the resurrection of Jesus. And this date is not just pulled out of thin air, but these early Christian authors of the beginning of the 3rd century, they use calendrical cycles, they use chronological arguments to try to figure out when Passover happened in the year of the crucifixion, whatever they thought the year was. And on that basis, they calculate it was March 25th, either for the Friday of the crucifixion or the Sunday of the resurrection. And this becomes a very popular and often repeated tradition. In the rest of the Roman Empire, it's mostly the crucifixion date, and in the East and later on in the Byzantine Empire, it tends to be the resurrection date. The fact that we have an attestation of March 25th in this role so early on makes it attractive to speculate that maybe the fact that later on the conception is attested as being dated to March 25th maybe has something to do with that resurrection or passion date. And since later sources make it very clear that they believe that the conception and the death happened on the same date, right? They make it very clear. You could speculate that maybe this was already an opinion quite early on, especially given the fact that we do have some attestation that early on the birth was considered to have happened in winter and the conception in spring. So maybe early on there was an attempt to parallelize, or an effort to parallelize calendrically the conception and the crucifixion. And since the crucifixion was already dated on March 25th by some scholars or authors, that could have given rise to December 25th. It's not entirely clear that it happened, but we have some indications in the sources. And that's essentially the basic idea behind the calculation theory.
This is how they figured, at least some early Christians figured. Is it necessarily proof that Christ was conceived on March 25th and born on December 25th? Do you think it's proof, or do you think it's just something that they believed and we can't conclusively say that this is how it had to happen?
Oh, this is something they believed. The thing is, of course, that the calendrical calculations that lead, for instance, Hippolytus of Rome to put the crucifixion on March 25th are based on flawed methods, in the sense that these are calendrical cycles that don't actually identify the actual Passover date in any of these years. And anyway, I mean, the underpinning of the assumption that the crucifixion happened on March 25th is the assumption that the crucifixion happened in AD 29. And I think most scholars nowadays would not accept that. They would assume that the crucifixion happened in AD 30, maybe AD 33, but later than AD 29. I mean, there are different opinions out there. It's a difficult, scholarly debate. I mean, the basic idea was sound, but the kind of calendrical cycles they used to arrive at these conclusions from our contemporary perspective were flawed.
When the early Christians began to celebrate a festival for the nativity of our Lord, do you think that it may have been a lot more simple back then? Like minus all the Santa Claus and the reindeer and all of that we have going on today, but minus a lot of the stuff that we see today on top of the commercialism. Do you think they may have just gotten together on December 25th, sang some hymns about the birth of Christ, had a meal, had a prayer, basically a church service? Would that kind of be a very primitive beginning of Christmas?
Yeah, I mean, all we really have in terms of evidence for early Christmas are sermons, right? It's just that it seems to be simply the case that the sermon on December 25th is about the birth of Christ rather than about anything else, right? That seems to be the nucleus of Christmas as far as we can tell. And if you look at the Orthodox and Apostolic churches in the East and the Orient, right, Christmas was never really an important festival. It was, throughout the history of these churches, really simply a liturgical date. Based on the fact that on this day in our calendar we commemorate the birth of Christ, and there's not that much more going on. There's not that much more in terms of folklore. So yes, I think you're right. From what I can tell, I'm not an expert on folklore, but from what I can tell, yes, the earliest sort of 4th, 5th century, 6th century Christmas was really very limited in its in the way it was celebrated.
You've mentioned the Orthodox Church a couple of times, and I think the Armenian Church. So I've noticed that they celebrate January 6th. I think the Armenian Church celebrates January 6th, Orthodox January 7th, which would still be, the eve would be the 6th as well. Was that something that was taking place during the time period, like 4th century, we were talking about the sermons from John Chrysostom and the other bishop or what have you. Was the church in some areas celebrating January 6th or 7th at that time, along with other people December 25th?
Yes, for a while there is a bit of an east-west split. I mean, December 25th quickly becomes the prevalent tradition, but there are churches in the east, in Egypt, in Jerusalem, and Armenia is, of course, the one place where this really remains the official tradition, where the date of Epiphany was considered to be the date of the birth. And I think that's partly rooted in the idea that Epiphany is also widely attested as the date of the baptism, that the baptism happened on January 6th. And there's some Christian sources which are very literal about Luke, or I think it's Luke 3:23, right? When Luke writes that Jesus was about 30 years old, and the text is very literally, right? He was baptized when he was exactly 30 years old. Which implied that the birth and the baptism happened on the same calendrical date. And I think that might have been a factor in electing January 6th as the date of the baptism and the birth of Christ. But by the 6th century, Epiphany has fallen out of favor as the nativity date, except in Armenia. And this is really the only church that I know of where this is still considered the birth date. The fact that other Orthodox churches celebrate on the 7th of January is simply an artifact, or simply a reflection of the fact that they use the Julian calendar and never wrong with the Gregorian reform. And so there's a 13-year differential between our 25th of December and their 25th of December, essentially.
So am I understanding you right that last point you made about the difference in the Julian and Gregorian calendar, that those particular Orthodox churches would have celebrated on December 25th prior to Pope Gregory's change in the 1500s?
Yes, and I mean, from their point of view, that they celebrate on December 25th, they simply use a different calendar.
But the Armenian Church would have actually celebrated on a different date, January 6th, even under the Julian calendar. Wow. Okay.
That's right. So the interesting thing is the Apostolic Armenian Church in Armenia itself switched to the Gregorian calendar in the early 20th century. But the Jerusalem branch of the Armenian Church, the so-called Patriarchate of Jerusalem, still uses the Julian calendar. So they celebrate on our 19th of January. It's for them, it's 6th, but in our calendar, it's the 19th.
Wow. Very interesting. Very interesting. Do you think that the two different dates, the December 25th date and the January 6th date, Armenian Church, do you think that could yield more credence to the calculation theory, in that maybe they were calculating from different dates of conception, maybe a March 25th conception and an early April conception, and thus 9 months would put different dates? You think there's anything to that?
There's a little bit of evidence of that. I don't think it's as strong as in the case of December 25th, but yeah, scholars have put forward various, small hints in the sources. There's, for instance, one local solar calendar where the 14th day of the spring month coincides with April the 6th, and that could have been the nucleus for then electing January 6th, right, because of this 9-month differential. And it, of course, is also worth noting that one of the crucifixion dates that has been put forward in modern scholarship is April the 7th of AD 30, which is pretty close, right?
Sure.
Again, if you parallelize that with the conception, then, January 6th is at least around the corner, but we don't really know exactly when and how January 6th became a date in the liturgical calendar. It's a bit murky.
Maybe they were just attaching the birth of Christ to the celebration of Epiphany that was already in existence, maybe?
That's certainly a possibility. I mean, according to Clement of Alexandria, the 6th of January was already considered to be the baptismal date of Christ by a particular Gnostic sect, the Basilidians.
Okay.
It's hard to say whether this really remained influential, since it's essentially a heretical sect from the perspective of mainline Christianity.
Sure.
But it's interesting to note that Clement already knew this date in relation with the significance of being the baptismal date, according to some.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think you've made it clear, at least if I'm understanding you right, that the date itself, the December 25th date, you don't think was borrowed from the Sol Invictus that came later in Rome, or winter solstice pagan festivals or anything like that. Am I understanding you right? I don't want to misquote you, but
I think my personal hunch is, based on everything I know, It's a confluence of two factors, right? These chronological calculations on the one hand, and also a bit of exegesis. On the other hand, solar symbolism, right? It's an attractive date because it's the solstice date. But solar symbolism is not the same thing as paganism, right? There's a homegrown, late antique Christian way of associating Christ with the sun. Whatever we think about this today, to them, this was not a holdover from paganism. They had their own sort of Christian solar symbolism, which is quite richly tested, and Martin Wallraff has documented this very clearly in his work.
When you were talking about the solar symbolism, my mind immediately raced to the prophecy of Malachi chapter 4, where it speaks of the Son of Righteousness. I remember one time I was talking with my grandfather, and I told him he was quoting the Son of Righteousness, and I asked him if he ever noticed it was spelled S-U-N in Malachi 4 verse 2, because he thought in his mind that it was spelled S-O-N. He had only heard it from church, the Son of Righteousness. And then we went and looked at it, and he used the King James Version, but it said the Son, the S-U-N of righteousness. And so this solar symbolism was even presented by a Hebrew prophet, probably based upon the calendar back in Genesis, chapter 1, with the sun and the moon and the stars, So
yes, so the one passage you mentioned, right, is exactly the one that is used on various occasions in early Christian literature, also in reference to the fact that Christ was born on the day of the winter solstice, at least later on. And of course, the Pascha Computus of 243, there, this passage is also invoked, but there it's invoked in reference to the opinion of this author that Christ was born on the day when the sun was created, which in his view was March 28th. But in other sources, you have the idea that Christ was the Son of Righteousness in relation to, this idea that it was conceived on the day of the vernal equinox, and then the traditional date of the vernal equinox. The thing, of course, we have to remember, these are just traditional dates. These weren't the actual dates of these solar events anymore in the 4th or 5th centuries, but they had a certain, they had a reputation for being the dates of the solstices and equinoxes, and there are appealed to in this way in late antique sources. Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but the point is, yes, this is a crucial passage to motivate solar symbolism in early Christianity.
When do you believe Christ was born, Dr. Nothaft?
It's really, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. I don't really have an opinion on that. I mean, there's one possibility which we didn't talk about, and maybe it's not really worth talking about, because obviously I proposed that December 25th was chosen because of this confluence of solar symbolism and calculation. But, there's an old sort of Orthodox and Catholic answer to that question, which is that, well, it's a tradition that was handed down by the apostles, right? And it was his actual birthday. I don't think it's particularly likely, because we don't really know that Jewish people in the in the late at this time recorded their birthdays, and they wouldn't have used the Julian calendar anyway. So this is a slightly dubious proposal on that basis. But I just wanted to mention that this is a scenario which we cannot discount entirely, technically. But my answer is really, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's why I asked. Have you ever run across anyone that claims that Christ was born in September or around the Feast of Tabernacles? Have you ever seen that theory put forth? Or?
Yes, my understanding, I hope I'm not misremembering, but I think one of the first attempts that were ever made to derive the date from the priestly courses, from the fact that Zechariah was a member of Abia, I think one of the first attempts in the 16th century arrived at that conclusion. I think Joseph Scaliger was one of the first prominent experts on chronology. I think he came to the conclusion that the birth probably happened in autumn. If it wasn't Scaliger, it was some other early modern chronologer. The point is that Scaliger was one of the first people to really derive an answer from from his knowledge of the priestly courses and from his knowledge of how calendars worked, essentially. And yes, that's, I think, that might be the first time a scholar proposed the autumn or the fall equinox was roughly that time of the year as the birth of Christ. I'm not really sure whether more recent scholars have supported that date, but I would guess that it's usually because of the specific way in which they reconstruct the priestly courses during the 1st century.
Dr. Nothaft, you have been a pleasure, man. You are a fountain of information, especially on chronology. So I really appreciate you taking your time out to do this. I do these interviews for educational purposes. I like for the general public to be able to listen to a scholar And a lot of times it's easier for us to listen to you guys than it is to read you guys.
Yes.
Hopefully you understand that. Sometimes I get to reading articles and everything, and I'm like, man, I got to go back and read it again and read it again. But when I can, sit down and talk and we can just converse, I can kind of grasp more about what you're saying. And you've really helped me, and hopefully you've helped all the men and women that are listening today.
I hope so. And thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you as well.